On January 10th, Trump canceled all charter flights to all Cuban cities, of which there were 9, except Havana. And charter flights to Havana are also going to be limited too. And obviously, you probably can guess how I feel about this. I mean, it's going to be horrible for Cuban families as well as the Cuban private sector. But before I really get into my opinions, I want to just give a brief recap of where the policy was and how Trump rolled it back, and basically how we got to where we are today. Not spending too much time, but just for context. So the United States has always had a travel ban as well as an economic embargo against Cuba. And within that travel ban, there's been a bunch of approved exempt categories for travel. But the catch was that in order to go there, you needed a specific license from the Office of Foreign Assets and Controls. Now, in the second term of Obama's presidency, when he started this détente, or this normalization of relations with Cuba, what he did, his main claim to fame here, was that he changed the requirement of a specific license to a general license. So that essentially meant that anyone could just go and travel to Cuba, and then when they came back, they were going through customs and they just check off a box. Why'd you go to Cuba? Oh, support for the Cuban people, individual people to people travel. Yep, no questions asked. And the messaging was very positive, and it was very easy to travel to Cuba. So with that small change and this general license for these 13 approved travel categories, the bonanza of U.S. tourists ensued. Cruises started up, commercial flights started, there was more charters, everybody started going to Cuba, and it was the latest craze. Then when Trump came to office in 2016, all that sort of stopped. Now, I don't even know what Trump's personal take on foreign policy towards Cuba is, because anybody who knows anything about our policy towards Cuba knows that it's controlled by the Cuban American exile community and the historically hardliner / isolationist people there. That includes Marco Rubio, Mario Lincoln Diaz-Balart, and the like. And so they wanted to do away with this whole Obama era opening. So brief recap of the actual changes. In June 2017, Trump's first announcement on this is that individual people-to-people travel was done for. Now, this was basically a cover for, because tourism, pure play tourism is illegal, but individual people-to-people travel was basically tourism. You could go there, no questions asked, and it didn't really have a lot of requirements associated with it. 2 years after that, in June of 2019, Trump then eliminates group people-to-people travel, and with that go cruises, private flights, corporate vessels, all that's done. Then in October of last year, the Trump administration announced that all commercial flights were going to be eliminated to those 9 Cuban cities except for Havana. And then finally, on January 10th, all charters to these 9 Cuban cities except for Havana were also eliminated. So here's what's left. For the average Joe Schmo American who wants to visit Cuba, they can either take a charter or commercial flight to Havana under the category of support for the Cuban people. But just on this announcement real quick that charters are going to be eliminated, this just sucks. This is going to really devastate Cuban and Cuban American families as well as the Cuban private sector, because while a lot of tourists were taking commercial flights, the charters are mainly used by Cubans to go visit their relatives on the island, some who live in provinces that are very far away from Havana. So now these people are going to have to land in Havana, and they're either going to have to take a Via Azul or Cubana de Aviación domestic flight, which both are pretty expensive. They're going to be paying the government to have to spend 15 plus hours on a bus to go visit their families in the provinces. Also on these charter flights, they're being used a lot by mules or mulas. And so if you've ever taken a flight to Cuba, you'll know that when you get to the airport, everybody is saran wrapping their bags like 50 times over. And that's because the Cuban government, the customs agents in the airport, they check the bags because they know that there's a lot of mules coming. And so mulas basically would take supplies and remittances in kind to Havana, but also the provinces, and these would form the basis for the inputs that then the Cuban private sector would resell, because the state prohibits wholesale markets for the private sector. So they don't have access to cheap goods to sell unless they go get them in Panama. So the mulas are, it's a huge industry in Cuba. So by eliminating the charter flights, we kind of play right into the Cuban government's hands, who's trying to limit the private sector by making it very difficult for these mullahs to get these inputs into the hands of the Cuban private sector. So families are going to get hurt, the private sector is going to get hurt, and I mean, I talked about this on Instagram. For everything that the Cuban Revolution did, one thing that you can't deny is that it really separated a lot of families, and now our government is playing into that exact same theme of separating Cuban families, all for political gain, to grab Cuban American votes in Miami. And hopefully it stops here, but who knows? This could continue all the way up until the election. Now, I always try to look at the bright side of everything, and I actually told people about this on my Instagram, but there's an app called Cuba, which was developed by a group of Cuban entrepreneurs. It's basically Cuban Uber, and you can, if you land in Havana, you can actually take transport from them, which is pretty reliable, which is, speaks to the private sector. It's tough to get reliable transportation in Cuba, but you can take reliable transportation from Havana to some of the remote provinces. And it's a good way to support the private sector. Yeah, so to wrap up on this whole thing, I basically told you guys what's left, commercial and charter to Havana under support for the Cuban people. And one quick point on this is the most effective way for people to travel to Cuba. This is basically like the express lane on the highway. Now, I'm personally a fan of keeping all lanes open on the highway, not just because of my rights as an American to be able to travel anywhere I want without restriction, but also because the more people we can get to Cuba, the more exchange of ideas, the more engagement, the more money into the hands of the Cuban private sector, the more we can build up Cuban civil society, which it just lacks. It's been eroded over the past 61 years. And then with that civil society, I think that's how change is really going to come about in Cuba in a slow, gradual, Cuban way. But it's through building that civil society. And so at this point, yes, the express lane is open on the highway. I'm a fan of all lanes, but I think we also have to fix the messaging and let people know, hey, the express lane is open, because we're not even telling them that now. But this is sort of a topic I've covered before, and that I'll probably cover again, video for another time. But that's where we stand on the elimination of the charter flights.